Please welcome Doctors Valerie Montgomery Rice, Christi Shaw, and Dr. Eric Topol with Fortune senior writer Beth Coet.
Good morning. So I want to start by turning the tables for a second here. So Eric and Christy, you recently had experiences that put you on the other side of the healthcare equation as patient and caregiver. So I want to talk for a second about what you learned. Who was in charge when you were in those situations? Eric, maybe you could start.
Okay. Well, Beth, I had a knee replacement surgery back a little more than a year and a half ago, but it was really due to a rare disease that I had in childhood called osteochondritis dissecans. At any rate, I'd had a lot of surgery prior to going to med school, and then I was told I would have to have surgery to replace the knees, decades later. But unfortunately, when I had that surgery, although technically it went fine, my orthopedist wasn't in touch with this prior condition, and that led to all sorts of complications after the surgery. So it was a lack of being on top of information, and only after I had to be rescued by a physical therapist did it become apparent that this gap of information, led to a very, kind of a nightmarish course. Actually, it involved a complication that I'd never even heard of called arthrofibrosis, which is more common than infection, which was the only complication that was laid out to me. So I think it's an example of when you have lack of information that's available to a physician that I certainly knew about, that that we can preempt this by arming both patients and their care providers, clinicians, with all the information about each person.
Wasn't it your wife that?
Yeah, my wife is the one that discovered my diagnosis. Exactly. She was trying to help me, knowing how desperate things were, and she found it on the internet, a book about it, and I said, oh wow, this is me. So yeah.
So caregivers are often key. So Christy, tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so my sister was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, and I decided to take a year off. I didn't know it was going to be a year. I basically said I needed to take care of her, and people said, gosh, why would you have that decision? Well, prior to that, both my mom and my dad had been through the healthcare system, mom with breast cancer and my dad with a rare infection. Both of them had passed away. And my older sister had taken care of my mom in hospice at home. And so one, I just felt it was my obligation and was happy to do it. But two, I thought, at the end of my life, if I have any regrets, what would they be? And I had regretted not doing more for my mother. I thought, I have to let the doctor do this. I was in Minnesota. My mom lived in Iowa. The doctor's king, and they know. Well, I found out later when I joined an oncology company and was leading oncology that had she actually gotten in a clinical trial at that time, she would have lived another 18 months to 5 years. And so I had regrets about that. So fast forward to caring for my sister. As I, helped her and seeing her in the hospital, here's somebody who's helpless, who doesn't understand the healthcare system, who doesn't understand scientific language, and just watching her and having all these doctors come in, come out, and just being a bit powerless over what's going to happen to her. And since I knew the healthcare system, being able to be her advocate as well as her caregiver was important.
Great, great. So, Valerie, I'd love to turn to you for a second here. So, in your view, is the patient now in the driver's seat? And how do you train doctors for this new world order?
Yeah, so thank you. I would say the patient is not yet in the driver's seat, but should be in the driver's seat. Right now, the disease is still in the driver's seat. And I think a reason for that is because of the limitations that we have put in place that limit the flow of information. Eric is giving you some examples. Others can give you examples that if they had known different things, or if they had had access to certain protocols or clinical trial data, or if I had had that previous x-ray and knew that this was going to happen, I could have, put in some things in place. And so I think the disease is still in control, and we need to really change that. How do we change that? Well, first of all, we had an earlier conversation about we need to modernize HIPAA. But, you know, I kept asking the question about, okay, well, what are the actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 things that we need to do to make a recommendation? We know that HIPAA is a law. However, there are guidances that can come through HHS and others to help us to guide, to increase the flow of information. Now, what we are currently doing as we're educating and training this next generation of healthcare professionals, we're exposing them to technology a lot sooner with medical school. Okay, they come understanding that they want anytime, anywhere, any place education. They come understanding how to use social media. They come with laptops. They come with lots of different things, but we have to get them with comfortable with using information and respecting the privacy that associated with it and the power of data. So exposure to the electronic health record starts in day 1 or day 2 of medical school as they start to get involved with patients. Then, though, the opportunity to be agile with information and to be comfortable with getting information from multiple sources, then to really integrate medical knowledge with being able to take information to make informed decisions. And again, that is just the way that we are now restructuring and redesigning our curriculums such that people are very comfortable with taking multiple sources and different types of information, integrating it with the medical knowledge to make informed decisions. And then the last thing that's most important, involving the patient in the decision tree. You have to understand who's sitting in front of you. Because just because I know that this is the best evidence based on the scientific information doesn't mean that it's the best decision for that patient. So really understanding that patient, understanding those cultural influences, understanding what barriers they have from socioeconomic factors, et cetera, is really critical to making sure that we make the best decision for patients.
So how is this changing the doctor-patient relationship? Eric, maybe you can talk about that to start.
Well, I think it's certainly compromised today. I agree with Valerie that we don't really have, 1969 was when this patient-centered medicine concept was brought out, and we aren't even close to that today. So what we have is, very limited time with patients, and the care and healthcare really isn't there. So we have a fractured, largely a patient-doctor relationship. And that really needs to change. It's not just about who's the boss, it's about this detachment, the lack of trust, the lack of bond. So here, it's so ironic that we're talking so much about AI when we are missing the human-to-human, the touch and the presence. I mean, we have hardly any presence because we have a 7-minute visit, working on a keyboard. So we're probably at the nadir of patient-doctor relationship, and I think that that's led to, as we heard earlier this morning, more of the sort of depression, disenchantment on the physician side, and obviously also on the patient side.
Mm-hmm. So what needs to change? How do we change that equation, that dynamic?
Well, it does need to change because if you look at the trajectory, it's just continuing to get worse. This is where I actually think technology could come to the rescue. That is, if we offset a lot of the tasks to machines' algorithms, as long as they're validated and they really work well, this could actually give the gift of time and the ability to restore what are the most fundamental aspects of caring for a patient, which is a great privilege.
Right.
But it isn't really happening today.
Right.
I can give an example just in caring for my sister. If I think about what Eric just said and the manual process that I went through that should be, I think could be automated. So as my sister went through her several different medicines or clinical trials, each time was reaching out, because I had been in the cancer field, to different thought leaders, different clinicians that I knew and said, what would be a recommendation based on her background? And then based on the feedback I would get, luckily she had a physician that was open to feedback. She had several before that one said, I don't like the chicken soup approach where everybody adds in. And I said, well, I think we need a different doctor then because one person can't know everything. And so that all worked for us for a while. My sister got to the point where she needed to have a donor transplant. Once we found out my younger sister was a match, she actually was too sick to go to transplant. And so they said, this is it. And I did one more reach out of my network, which I think if this was all electronic and you could actually do the data sourcing and see everything that's out there, I was fortunate that there were two of the thought leaders that had seen a publication of a study that had just been published that was out of Switzerland, 40 patients with refractory multiple myeloma. 2/3 of them had responded to a regimen of a generic HIV drug and Velcade. And so I gave that to her doctor, and he was willing to give it a try. And within a month, her cancer was down 90%. And so as we continue to see the science, I mean, people say, well, how long do you need on survival of a medicine to really make it worth the cost? She actually had gone from maybe 6 months on a medicine to actually towards the end, 1 month, 2 weeks, enough to bridge her to the next one. And it's been 4 years until that next thing pops. So, I mean, the science is exploding and it's coming so fast at us that we need to kind of figure out how to harness it with digital to make sure that we can access it at our fingertips and not have to do it so manually.
You know, we talk about the art of medicine. You know, people always talk about with the art of medicine. Well, clearly, if we just continue to go down algorithms, we somewhat lose some of that art. And I think the art of medicine is the ability to be able to communicate with the patient, but also to communicate with one another, to really help fill in some of the gaps with my brain, as hard as I want to process, cannot process everything, right? So I need other persons, other providers that I could communicate with to help be that artificial intelligence for me. And I think that Eric made a good point. We need to take out the mundaneness. So I really don't understand why, and I know that it's coming forth. The time they spend in electronic health record is just burdensome. I mean, it is really challenging providers, particularly when you have providers who have been in the field for many years, who did not learn like these students learn now. And so we really ought to perfect the technology that they should be able to walk in the room and then they could start to talk to the patient. Voice recognition allows for the 2 to 3 distinct voices to be heard, and all of that is being transcribed into the record right then. Then the patient and the provider should be able to critique it before he or she even goes out the door. Doing that will remove a lot of the burden for the providers, such that they have time to think and then be more receptive to communicating with other providers about how to give the best care.
Great, that's a really good point. I want to open it up to questions in a second here, but first I want to ask about, we had this in defense of science session yesterday, and so if you're giving more agency to the patient, how do you make sure that they are getting the right information, that they are getting, that they have sort of the background and knowledge that's necessary to make really smart decisions? I don't know who wants, maybe.
So sometimes they won't, right? Sometimes they're going to bring you erroneous information that based on your knowledge, that you're going to be able to hopefully walk them through why this is not accurate, or that why it's not an evidence-based approach. But the key thing is you still have to hear them. I'm an infertility specialist, and I can tell you most patients who go through IVF are very well informed. And so they would come with your statistics compared to somebody else's statistics and what protocol they wanted to use, et cetera. And I would listen. And sometimes I would say to them, okay. I mean, I think there's about a 5% chance difference with the success here. But because you've done this background work, and because I know that it's only a 5% difference, and I also know and believe that stress enters into a person's ability to be successful, I can listen and am comfortable enough that I can remove that level of stress for you where my ego is not deflated, that then we can work together, I think, and have a more positive outcome. Now, the outcome may not be that they walk away with a baby, but the outcome may be that they recognize that they've done and contributed in ways that they had the opportunity to perfect their treatment.
Great, great. Do we have any questions? Right back here.
Hi, Craig LaFay from RTI International. Who's the boss? Part of what I haven't heard about, and I'd like to hear some reaction to, is other external factors that contribute to what happens between that patient and that clinician. One of my favorite studies, for example, found that for pediatricians, there were over 200 recommendations being made by either their professional association, other medical societies, or not-for-profits about what they should be doing at every clinical encounter, everything from counseling about violence prevention to flossing your teeth. So quickly adding that up, if you have to go through 200 recommendations about what you should be talking about with a parent and a child in 7 minutes, it's very hard to attend to the presenting complaint. Pushing that out to current times, there's a lot of emphasis now on how physicians should be prescribing opioids, whether it's CDC guidelines, whether it's laws and regulations that are being passed by the states. How does all this context go into influencing this conversation about AI, clinical care, patient ownership, and so forth? What are your thoughts on that?
Christy, Eric, do you want to take it first, or?
Sure.
Go for it.
So I'll start with the second one first, maybe on the opioid piece. You know, I think a lot of this comes down to human nature, right? So what are we incentivized to do? And one of the things we found is when you have guidelines that are quality guidelines of how satisfied are our patient. So one of the things maybe many of you already know, but when Medicare actually judges you on how satisfied a patient is, when they come out of your office and they rate you, it's an incentive for the doctor to make sure that that patient's feeling no pain. One of the things we need to balance too is that there's an opioid crisis, but there's still a pain crisis. And so we can't go overboard by saying, okay, let's limit it to 3 days of opioids. If I take my sister as an example, she would be in severe pain. And so that we do need to balance these recommendations to say, what is specific to this patient type today? What are the things that are driving this behavior? Because the US is the only country that has this kind of issue. It's not happening in other countries. So it's obviously solvable, and we've obviously created this for some reasons. And so I think it's got to be physician specific there. And then on the pediatric piece, I was just imagining as you were asking the question, what are all of the things that we can do before we get to the doctor's office? You know, you always have to make sure you have your financial information all done before you can even see the doctor. What if we actually had our education completed before we got there? And then you can use that 7 minutes to talk about the questions you have that were unanswered versus, you know, having to go through the 200 at the office.
Yeah, and I was just going to pick up on that point, and that is the shift of patients, people generating their own data. We're going to see much more of that already today. Obviously, that's the case in diabetes and in heart rhythm, and even people doing their own sleep apnea, home testing, and on and on. Right. Even doing various components of the physical exam. That's a whole lot different relationship than this top-down guideline conduit. Rather, these are my data. Doctor, what do you think I should do on the basis of that? And unfortunately today, a lot of physicians and clinicians in general are not so keen on people generating their data. They diss it. And that's something that we need to actually embrace and cultivate, that each person is taking much more charge of their care.
I think we have to remember it's a team. So most of our students go into primary care. And we still have about 60% of our kids who go and practice in underserved areas where they are the only primary care doctor within a 100-mile radius. They could not do this without a team, though. They have to have nurse practitioners or certified nurse specialists, and they have to have partnerships with community health workers, et cetera, who are helping to go out in the community. And then we have to create the accountability bidirectionally. Patients should come to us having done some of the pre-work, and then being able to have a much more targeted discussion about gaps that they don't understand or where they need more information, and we ought to require that and expect it. And they should expect that that's what we should expect.
Well, the interesting thing, I read a statistic that 89% of Americans look at their phone within 1 hour of waking up. Yeah. And the average time
probably
per day,
more like 5 minutes, I would think.
Yeah, right, for most of us maybe.
That long?
That long. And over 47 times a day they're checking it. Yet you look at things like adherence at 50%. If we could actually marry the two to say, when you pick up your phone, I'm going to remind you where you are on XYZ of your disease and your management, and how are you doing on that, and then actually send that to your doctor so that when you do show up, you have that. I mean, we have the technology. I remember the first time Dr. Topol talked about the creative destruction of medicine. Such a great thing to talk about, but the sad thing is nothing's really happened significantly to change it. We have all of these industries that are not about health and human beings and our loved ones, books, music, et cetera, that have totally disrupted. We don't go to a library anymore. Well, how about we don't go to a doctor anymore? How about if we sit at home and make sure we can do everything at the tip of our fingers and only go when we absolutely have to?
Absolutely.
We can do that, but why don't we?
Yeah.
Great. Let's try to squeeze in one other question over here.
There's a question for actually the responsibility of the pharmaceutical industry to take account of this challenge, because actually the reason a lot of it's subjective is because we've studied the drugs so poorly that we can't help guide this patient should be getting X and this patient should be getting Y. So if we truly want to be patient-centric, we would be providing that kind of information to physicians, to patients, to the healthcare system. But if you take, say, all of the RA drugs have done the same studies in the same patients against the same scales, so we can't really differentiate based on those. So we're left to the subjective hunches or experience of the physicians. Maybe Christy, what kind of responsibility does the industry play?
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I've been in the industry for 30 years, and just following blindly what the quickest path is to get approval is no longer the answer. You have to demonstrate a lot more. We just happened to finish a rheumatoid arthritis study when I first came on board at Lilly that actually has within it the amount of pain medications you're on and how many you actually reduced. Being able to show those kinds of things. But if we talk about digital, actually, that's exactly what we need to do. We just, in 2012, we did a couple things. In 2012, we were able to show brain imaging that was the first diagnostic of Alzheimer's disease. You say, okay, we don't have a medicine for that yet, but what is it doing just by itself? I didn't know this until a year ago, but 50% of patients are never even know that they have Alzheimer's disease. And those 50% that are told, I mean, could you imagine having cancer and not being told you had cancer? This is happening to Alzheimer's patients. Then the 50% that actually know they have Alzheimer's disease, half of those are misdiagnosed. They're either diagnosed that they have Alzheimer's and they don't, or they don't have Alzheimer's and they do. And so those kinds of pieces we need to, as a pharmaceutical industry, incorporate. Another example would be in diabetes. So many patients affected with diabetes. We have a clinical trial right now called Connected Care, which actually you can wear and measure and actually automatically delivers your insulin. Why is that important? So you don't have eye problems, you don't have amputations, you don't have strokes. And it's very hard all the time to keep checking your own blood sugar, and now Apple says that you'll be able to do glucose monitoring on a watch in a short period of time without having to prick your finger. So I am 100% in agreement with you, and the other thing we need to do is find that pathway through FDA that says, you know, can we please do the digital approval along with the medicine? And I think Scott Gottlieb is on board with that.
Great.
You know, I would just add, so we have made a lot of progress in digitizing human beings in terms of genomically defining, for example, in cancer and pairing up therapies with mutations or the immunome status of a person. But getting to your point, there's almost 200 drugs that are FDA approved that have a genomic label, and we don't use any of that data. These are not cancer drugs in our daily practice of medicine. We have an amazing amount of knowledge base that we don't adopt to the care of patients, and it's really unfortunate.
Great. Okay, well, we are actually out of time, Eric. Thanks for the last word there, and thanks to the Square
Thank you.
panel.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.